I don't want my $1 million aunt to pass away, but I kinda need rent money. My mom mentioned Great Aunt Sierra at Thanksgiving dinner like she was discussing a lottery ticket. She lived alone in this massive house in Westchester with no kids and no other relatives besides us. Mom said Sierra was 92 and probably didn't have much time left. She said it with this look that meant I should start being a good great niece immediately. I was drowning in student loans and working 2 jobs just to afford my studio apartment. The idea of inheriting even a fraction of Sierra's money felt like my only way out. So I started visiting her that December with a plan to become her favorite person before it was too late. The first visit was awkward as hell. Sierra lived in this old Victorian house that smelled like lavender and furniture polish. She was this tiny woman with silver hair pinned up perfectly and wearing a pearl necklace at 2 in the afternoon. She looked at me through these thick glasses and said she didn't remember having a great niece. I explained who my grandmother was and watched her face light up with recognition. I started coming every Sunday with a routine. I'd bring grocery store flowers and cookies, then sit through her stories about the old days. I smiled and nodded while she talked about people who died before I was born. I checked my phone under the table and counted the antiques I could see from the living room. Everything felt like a performance I had to nail. Her hands shook when she poured, but she never spilled a drop. She'd served these butter cookies that tasted like cardboard, but I ate them anyway. I complimented everything from her doilies to her ancient cat, Mrs. Snowball, who hissed at me every visit. By the 3rd week, she started remembering my name. She'd wait by the window for my car and wave when I pulled up. I felt guilty for about 5 seconds, then remembered my student loan balance. I needed this to work, so I kept showing up and playing the perfect great niece role. The stories got more interesting as she got comfortable with me. Sierra had been a nurse in Korea and met her husband at a military hospital. She showed me black and white photos of herself looking young and confident in her uniform. She'd traveled to 30 countries after her husband died and had albums full of adventures. I started actually listening instead of just pretending. 2 months in, she asked me to help clean out her attic, which was stuffed with 70 years of memories. We spent hours going through boxes while she told me the story behind every item. She found her wedding dress wrapped in tissue paper and held it up to me. She said I was about her size when she got married. That's when things started changing. She began teaching me how to cook her famous pot roast recipe. She'd stand next to me at the stove, fixing my technique with gentle corrections. She showed me how to knit, even though I was terrible at it. My scarves looked like dishcloths, but she displayed them proudly on her couch. She started calling me during the week just to chat. She'd ask about my job at the bookstore and remember my coworkers' names. She'd give me advice about my terrible boyfriend that was actually spot on. She never had kids, but somehow knew exactly what to say when I was struggling. Then came the day that changed everything. I showed up for our usual Sunday visit and found her on the kitchen floor. She'd fallen trying to reach something on a high shelf. Her face was pale and she could barely speak. I called 911 with shaking hands and rode with her in the ambulance. I held her hand while she looked at me with terrified eyes. The doctor said she'd broken her hip and needed surgery. They asked if I was family and I said yes without thinking. I stayed overnight in that uncomfortable hospital chair. I helped her eat when her hands shook too much. I brushed her silver hair because she hated how the hospital pillow made it messy. When they moved her to rehab, I visited every single day. I brought her real food because she hated the hospital meals. I wheeled her to the garden when she felt strong enough. I read her favorite mystery novels out loud when her eyes were too tired. Other patients started thinking I was her granddaughter and neither of us corrected them. One afternoon, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. She looked me right in the eyes and said she knew why I'd started visiting. She said she wasn't stupid and recognized a hustler when she saw one, and that if I wanted her money, I needed to do something for her. Fingers squeezed mine harder while she told me she wanted me to help her die at home when the time came, not stuck in some place that smelled like bleach and sadness. The words hit me so hard I actually pulled back, but her grip stayed strong. She shook her head and said she didn't mean tomorrow or next week. She meant when her body finally gave out completely. She wanted someone who'd make sure she could stay in her own bed with her own things around her. My throat went dry because this wasn't what I expected at all. I told her that sounded illegal, but she waved her other hand like she was swatting a fly. She said she didn't want me to kill her, just to make sure nobody dragged her to a nursing home to rot. She'd watched too many friends disappear into those places and come out in boxes. Her eyes got this hard look I'd never seen before as she described visiting her best friend Martha in a facility where they tied her to a wheelchair because she kept trying to walk even though her legs didn't work anymore. She said Martha died strapped to that chair begging to go home. Sierra's voice cracked when she said she'd rather die tomorrow than end up like that. She told me she'd already talked to her lawyer about setting up everything legal, a healthcare proxy and advance directives and a trust for home care. She needed someone young and strong enough to fight for her wishes when doctors and social workers started making decisions. Someone who wouldn't cave when things got hard or gross or expensive. She looked right at me and said she knew I wanted her money bad enough to see it through. The rehab nurse came in then to check Sierra's blood pressure and give her the afternoon pills. I watched the nurse handle Sierra like she was made of glass, checking her surgical site and asking about pain levels. Sierra answered all the questions but kept looking at me the whole time. When the nurse left, Sierra told me she'd already put money aside for my student loans in her will. But if I agreed to be her healthcare proxy and make sure she died at home, she'd pay them off right now while she could watch me be free. She said the number out loud, $43,000, and my chest got tight because she knew exactly what I owed. She gave me 3 days to think about it and research what being a healthcare proxy really meant. She didn't want me agreeing to something I didn't understand just for the money. She wanted me to know what I was signing up for. I left the rehab place with my head spinning, and drove straight to the library instead of going home. I spent 4 hours reading about advance directives and DNR orders and healthcare proxies. I learned about feeding tubes and ventilators and comfort care versus aggressive treatment. The more I read, the more I understood what Sierra was really asking. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept picturing Sierra alone in that huge house when her mind started going or her body got weaker. I remembered finding her on the kitchen floor, how small she looked, how her whole body shook with fear. I knew she wasn't scared of dying. She was scared of losing control. The next morning, I called my bookstore manager and said I had a family emergency. Then I drove back to the rehab center with a notebook full of questions. I asked Sierra about DNR orders, and she said absolutely. No CPR when her heart was ready to stop. I asked about feeding tubes, and she made a face like I'd offered her poison. I asked about pain management, and she said she wanted enough drugs to stay comfortable, but not so much she couldn't think. She answered every question clearly, no hesitation, like she'd been thinking about this for years. After lunch, a woman in a navy suit showed up carrying a leather briefcase. Sierra introduced her as Jade Hong, her estate attorney for the past 20 years. Jade shook my hand with a firm grip and sat down like she owned the place. She pulled out a folder thick with papers and started explaining how healthcare proxies worked in our state. She showed me the forms Sierra would sign, making me her official representative for medical decisions, if she couldn't make them herself. She explained I'd have legal authority to enforce Sierra's wishes even if other family members disagreed. She said the documents would protect me from lawsuits as long as I followed Sierra's documented preferences. Then Jade pulled out another folder about the trust Sierra was setting up for home care. The numbers made my eyes water because there was enough money to pay for round-the-clock aides for at least 5 years. Sierra had thought of everything, including a salary for me as care coordinator, $2,500 a month to manage schedules and medical appointments, and make sure her wishes got followed. Jade showed me receipts for things Sierra had already bought: a hospital bed that could go in the first-floor library, a wheelchair, a walker, grab bars for the bathrooms. Looking at all those papers, I realized Sierra wasn't planning to die anytime soon. She was planning to live as long as possible in her own house on her own terms. The trust included money for home modifications, visiting nurses, physical therapy, even a live-in aide when things got bad. She'd researched every possible scenario and made a plan for each one. On the third day, I came back and told Sierra yes. She squeezed my hand and said she knew I would. That underneath all my hustle, I had a good heart that just needed the right reason to show itself. We spent the next week going through medical paperwork while her mind was still sharp. She made me write down everything from what drugs she was allergic to what music she wanted playing when she was dying. She told me she wanted Ella Fitzgerald at the end, not church hymns. The physical therapist Jacob Lee came in every afternoon to help Sierra practice getting in and out of bed safely. He showed me how to support her weight without hurting my back, how to help her pivot from bed to wheelchair. I practiced while he watched, learning to move her without causing pain. Sierra told me about her husband's death while Jacob worked on her leg exercises. The hospital had ignored his DNR and kept him alive on machines for 3 weeks because the doctor said there was still hope. Her voice broke when she described his body swelling from the fluids they pumped in, his eyes vacant, his hands tied down so he couldn't pull out the tubes. She said he died looking nothing like himself, and she'd never forgive them for stealing his dignity. That evening, my mom called while I was still at the rehab center. She asked how Sierra was doing, her voice all fake concern while she fished for information about the will. I told her Sierra was getting stronger every day and changed the subject to my cousin's new baby. Mom kept trying to bring it back to Sierra's money, but I just kept deflecting until she got frustrated and hung up. The next morning, the rehab director called me into her office and showed me the discharge paperwork scheduled for the following Tuesday. My stomach did this weird flip because suddenly this whole thing felt way more real than I'd expected. She handed me a stack of papers about home care services and said I'd need to arrange everything before Sierra came home. I drove straight to Jade's office downtown, where she already had 3 home health agencies lined up for interviews that afternoon. The first agency sent this woman who talked about Sierra like she wasn't even in the room, using words like patient management and compliance protocols that made my skin crawl. The second agency guy kept pushing their most expensive package without listening to what Sierra actually needed. Then Jade's brother Shin walked in wearing regular jeans and a polo shirt instead of scrubs. He sat down next to Sierra's bed and asked her what TV shows she liked, then laughed when she admitted to watching reality dating shows. He told her those shows were trash, but he watched them too, and they spent 10 minutes arguing about which season was the worst. Sierra actually smiled for real, not that polite fake smile she gave the others. Shin explained how he'd help her maintain independence while keeping her safe, talking directly to her instead of over her head to me and Jade. We hired him on the spot, and he said he could start the day she got home. I called both my jobs that night and told them I needed a week off for a family emergency. My bookstore manager was cool about it, but the coffee shop manager got pissy until I reminded him I hadn't taken a sick day in 2 years. I spent the next 5 days at Sierra's house getting everything ready with a contractor Jade recommended. We installed grab bars in all 3 bathrooms, those sturdy metal ones that could hold serious weight. The contractor removed every loose rug and fixed the uneven floorboard by the kitchen that I'd tripped on twice myself. We moved Sierra's bedroom furniture from upstairs to the library on the first floor, setting up her antique bed where the reading chairs used to be. I packed away the fragile decorations from the lower shelves and moved her favorite books within easy reach. The contractor installed a ramp over the front steps and better lighting along the hallway to the bathroom. I stocked the kitchen with easy open containers and moved everything she used daily to the lower cabinets. Tuesday morning arrived sunny and warm for March, and I picked Sierra up in my car since ambulance transport wasn't covered. She looked so small in the wheelchair the aide brought out, wearing her pearl necklace over a cardigan I'd brought from home. The drive took forever in traffic, and she gripped my hand at every red light. When we pulled into her driveway, she started crying, just quiet tears rolling down her face. Shin was already there waiting on the porch, and he helped transfer her from the car to the wheelchair like he'd done it 1,000 times. Mrs. Snowball came running from wherever she'd been hiding, and actually purred when she saw Sierra, rubbing against the wheelchair wheels. Sierra reached down to pet her, and the cat jumped right into her lap, something I'd never seen her do before. We got her settled in the library bedroom, and she looked around at how we'd arranged everything, nodding at each change. She asked Shin to help her to the bathroom just to prove she could do it, gripping the new grab bars and taking slow, careful steps. That first night, I set myself up in the guest room with my door cracked open in case she called out. I heard her get up around midnight, the squeak of the hospital bed rails we'd installed, then her slow shuffle to the bathroom. I wanted to jump up and help, but forced myself to stay in bed, remembering what Shin said about letting her maintain dignity through independence. She got up again at 3, and I listened to every sound, ready to run if I heard her fall. The toilet flushed, water ran, and she made it back to bed without incident. In the morning, Shin arrived at 7 sharp with coffee and bagels for everyone. He helped Sierra shower and dress while I made her breakfast the way she liked it, scrambled eggs with cheese and wheat toast cut into triangles. Another aide named Lucas came at 3 to cover the evening shift, a quiet older man who brought crossword puzzles to do with her. I spent my days coordinating everything, scheduling her follow-up appointments, organizing her 12 different medications into those weekly pill containers, fielding calls from medical supply companies. The insurance company needed prior authorization for her walker, so I spent 3 hours on the phone arguing with them while Sierra napped. I still worked my bookstore shifts in the mornings while Shin was there, racing back for the afternoon gap before Lucas arrived. After a week, Sierra felt strong enough to cook again, calling me into the kitchen to teach me her mother's beef stew recipe. She sat in her wheelchair directing while I chopped vegetables, correcting my knife technique with sharp little comments. I wrote everything down in a notebook this time, measurements and timing, and the secret ingredient she made me swear not to tell anyone. She taught me her cornbread recipe next, then her apple pie, and I filled that notebook knowing these recipes were gifts she wanted to pass on. 3 weeks after she came home, I walked into the kitchen and she looked at me confused, asking who I was and why I was in her house. My chest got tight, but I stayed calm, told her I was her great niece, and showed her the photos on the refrigerator of us together. The confusion cleared after 20 minutes, but we both knew what it meant, that her mind was starting to slip. Jade came over that afternoon with more paperwork, updating power of attorney documents while Sierra was still legally competent to sign them. Sierra's hand shook as she signed, but her voice was steady when she confirmed she understood what she was agreeing to. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from my boyfriend saying he was done wasting time with someone who cared more about an old lady than him. I stared at that text for 5 minutes before Sierra asked what was wrong, and I just started crying. She wheeled herself over and pulled me down into a hug, her thin arms surprisingly strong around my shoulders. She made me chamomile tea with honey and told me about her own terrible boyfriend from nursing school who dumped her for missing a dance to study. She said I deserved someone who understood that caring for people were a strength, not a weakness. 2 days later, a social worker named Aurora Lai showed up for a home assessment, carrying a clipboard and wearing sensible shoes. She walked through every room checking our safety modifications, asking detailed questions about Sierra's care routine, and reviewing all our documentation. She watched Shin help Sierra with her exercises and nodded approvingly at how gentle but firm he was with the movements. Aurora said our setup was one of the most thorough she'd seen and gave me a folder about caregiver support groups that met at the community center. She mentioned her brother Jacob worked at the rehab facility and had told her good things about how dedicated I'd been during Sierra's recovery. Aurora mentioned the caregiver support group met Tuesday nights at the community center, so I went the next week. The room had about 20 people sitting in metal chairs drinking bad coffee from paper cups. Everyone looked tired, but they all nodded when I walked in like they already knew my story. A woman talked about her husband with dementia, who kept trying to drive to a job he retired from 10 years ago. A guy my age described moving back home to care for his dad after a stroke. Nobody had answers, but hearing their stories made me feel less alone with the weight of taking care of Sierra. I went back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. 3 weeks later, I woke up to Shin calling at 5 in the morning. Sierra couldn't move her left arm and her face looked wrong on one side. The ambulance came fast and I followed in my car with all her medical folders in a tote bag. The emergency room doctor confirmed she'd had a stroke but said her speech center wasn't affected. They ran tests all morning while Sierra kept squeezing my hand with her good right hand. The neurologist said it was minor but would need immediate physical therapy to get function back. Jacob from the rehab facility came to the hospital to start exercises that same day. He moved her left arm through gentle stretches while she winced but never complained. We brought her home after 4 days with a whole new routine to follow. Shin adjusted all her exercises to work around the weakness on her left side. Lucas helped modify the bathroom with extra grab bars on both walls. I rearranged the kitchen so everything she needed was on the right side within easy reach. Sierra adapted faster than any of us expected. She learned to butter toast one-handed and figured out how to put on her cardigan by draping it over her shoulders first. The physical therapist came 3 times a week, and slowly her left hand started responding again. One afternoon while we sat watching old movies, she grabbed my wrist with her weak left hand. She looked right at me and made me promise something important. When her mind started going like her body was, I had to remember who she really was. Not the confused old woman she might become, but the sharp, funny, independent person she'd always been. She said she trusted me to know when she couldn't be herself anymore. I promised, even though my throat felt tight thinking about making those decisions. 2 days later, Jade called saying Sierra wanted to meet about something financial. We sat at the dining room table while Jade pulled out her laptop and showed me a bank screen. Sierra had transferred $43,000 to pay off my student loans completely. The screen showed zero balance on every single account. I started crying right there at the table while Sierra watched with this satisfied look on her face. She'd called the loan companies herself that morning to make sure everything processed correctly. Jade had a bottle of champagne in her bag that she'd brought at Sierra's request. We opened it even though Sierra could barely manage tiny sips through a straw. She told me the money was always meant for exactly this purpose. She wanted both of us to be free, me from debt and her from worry about my future. She said watching me work 2 jobs while taking care of her broke her heart. 6 months went by with a rhythm of good days and harder ones. Sierra's mind stayed sharp most of the time, but her body kept finding new ways to fail. Her left side got stronger, but her balance got worse. She needed the walker all the time now instead of just for longer distances. Some days she'd forget words for things and get frustrated trying to explain what she wanted. Other days she was completely herself, teaching me new recipes and telling stories about her travels. Winter came and with it a bad cough that wouldn't go away. Sierra's breathing got rough and she started running a fever on a Sunday night. I called Shin, who said to take her to the emergency room immediately. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and admitted her right away for IV antibiotics. This time, I came prepared with her advance directive and healthcare proxy papers in a folder. The nurses actually listened when I explained she didn't want aggressive interventions if things got bad. The hospitalist reviewed all her documents and made notes in her chart about her specific wishes. Sierra spent a week in the hospital fighting the infection. The antibiotics worked but left her exhausted and even weaker than before. When she came home, she needed help with everything, including eating and getting dressed. She hated needing so much help, but thanked Shin and me constantly for keeping her dignity intact. She'd apologize for being a burden, and we'd remind her she was family, not a burden. One morning, she called me into her room holding a box of old stationery. She wanted to write letters to friends while she still could manage it. Her handwriting was shaky, but she insisted on doing it herself while I addressed the envelopes. She told me stories about each person as we worked through her address book. There was her roommate from nursing school who lived in Florida now. Her husband's best friend from the army who still sent Christmas cards every year. We spent whole afternoons working through that box of stationery together. Then came the morning that changed everything again. I walked into her room with her morning pills and she looked at me with complete confusion. She asked who I was and why a stranger was in her house. She tried to get out of bed to call the police but couldn't manage it with her weak left side. I stayed calm and told her my name, but she didn't recognize it at all. The fear in her eyes made my chest hurt, but I kept my voice steady and gentle. After an hour, the confusion cleared and she remembered everything, including the episode itself. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she was scared of losing herself completely. I helped her back to bed and called Shin to come early because I couldn't handle this alone anymore. That night, I barely slept, listening for any sounds from her room and checking on her every hour. The next morning, I called my bookstore manager and explained I needed to take leave to care for Sierra. He said he understood and my job would be there whenever I was ready to come back. I packed a bag and moved into Sierra's guest room full-time because these episodes were happening more often now. Sierra was still here, but fading slowly, getting smaller and quieter each day. We spent hours sitting together on the porch while I read her favorite mysteries out loud. She'd close her eyes and listen, sometimes falling asleep mid-chapter. I'd keep reading anyway because the sound of my voice seemed to calm her. Some days she'd forget breakfast or ask me the same question 5 times in an hour. Other days she was completely herself, sharp and funny, and giving me advice about everything. Those good days got fewer as spring turned to summer. Jade came over with a stack of legal documents thicker than a phone book. We spent 3 hours going through every detail while Sierra was having a clear day. She signed papers for power of attorney, healthcare directives, and financial management. Jade explained each document carefully, making sure Sierra understood what she was signing. Sierra's hand shook, but her signature was still neat and precise. She looked at both of us and said she trusted us to do right by her when she couldn't speak for herself anymore. Jade had thought of everything, from funeral arrangements to how Sierra wanted her house maintained. Every wish was documented and legally protected. That afternoon, Sierra asked me to sit with her in the garden. She took my hand and told me she was proud of me. She said I'd become the granddaughter she never had, that blood didn't make family, but showing up did. She said the money was never really the test. The test was whether I'd stay when things got hard and messy and sad. She said I passed with flying colors. Her eyes were clear and bright as she talked about how I'd changed from that desperate girl counting antiques to someone who genuinely cared. She thanked me for giving her a reason to keep fighting, for making her last months meaningful. A week later, on one of her good days, Sierra called me to her bedroom. She opened her jewelry box and pulled out the pearl necklace she always wore. She fastened it around my neck with trembling fingers and made me promise to wear it somewhere wonderful. She wanted me to travel to all the places she'd told me about, to see the world she'd explored after her husband died. She made me swear I wouldn't keep it locked in a box but would actually live with it. The pearls felt warm against my skin, and I promised her I'd go everywhere she'd been and then some. We started going through her photo albums again, even though we'd seen them a dozen times. She told me the same stories, but I listened like it was the first time. I recorded her voice on my phone while she talked about meeting her husband and traveling to Paris and learning to cook from an Italian grandmother. I saved every story, Every laugh, every piece of advice she gave between the rambling. She'd point at pictures and sometimes remember every detail. Other times she'd ask who those people were. I'd explain gently, and she'd nod like she was hearing it for the first time. Summer turned to fall, and Sierra spent more time sleeping than awake. Shin and I developed a routine where one of us was always with her. She ate less and less, just tiny bites of soup or pudding. Her body was shutting down, but she was peaceful about it. She'd told us months ago she was ready when her time came. One morning in October, 8 months after our deal in the rehab facility, Sierra didn't wake up when I brought her morning pills. Her breathing was different, slower and deeper. Shin checked her vitals and called Jade, who came right over. We all knew this was it. Sierra had gotten exactly what she wanted, to die at home with dignity. Shin and I sat on either side of her bed holding her hands. She never woke up, but her breathing got quieter and quieter until it just stopped. It was peaceful, exactly how she'd wanted it. No machines, no strangers, no sterile hospital room, just her own bed in her own house with people who loved her. At her memorial service a week later, I stood at the podium wearing her pearl necklace. I told everyone the truth about our relationship, how I'd started visiting for her money and she'd known it all along. I explained how we'd both been hustlers in our own way, her hustling for companionship, and me hustling for financial freedom. I told them how that transactional beginning had grown into real love, how sometimes the best relationships grow from the most unexpected ground. People actually smiled through their tears when I described Sierra's test and how she'd orchestrated everything perfectly. Whew, that was a lot to take in, right? Thanks for hanging in there with me through all the questions and wondering. Really hope you enjoyed exploring this alongside me. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.